March 12, 1942. Off the coast of Mindanao, Philippines. The night was absolute, a void of black water and starless sky. The only sounds were the low, anxious thrum of the PT boat's engines and the slosh of the swell against its thin wooden hull. General Douglas MacArthur stood on the deck, a rigid, gaunt figure in a leather flight jacket, his eyes fixed on the receding dark silhouette of the island. In his hand, crumpled, was a piece of paper, the last radiogram from the tunnels of Corregidor. The smell of fuel oil, sweat, and despair hung in the air. He had just been ordered to leave, to abandon his men, his adopted country, and a collapsing defense to the Japanese. As the boat turned south towards the open sea, a Japanese propaganda radio broadcast, crackling through the static on a crewman's receiver, seemed to pierce the darkness itself. It mocked the fleeing general with a new, jeering title, Dugout Doug. They painted him as a coward, hiding in a hole while his men died. In that moment, hunched on the deck of a frail torpedo boat, the legend of his humiliation was sealed. But it was in this exact moment of deepest defeat that a different legend was born, one of a return so massive, so vengeful, that it would shake an empire. This is not the story of a retreat. This is a story of a promise, and the 600 ships that would make it a reckoning. The bitter pill of deliverance. The 560-mile journey to the southern Philippines was a torment. 4 PT boats, *PT-41*, *PT-32*, *PT-34*, and *PT-35*, bobbed like toys through the contested waters of the Visayan Sea. Inside the cramped cabin of *PT-41*, MacArthur was a silent volcano. With him were his wife Jean, their 4-year-old son Arthur, and a handful of key staff, including Chief of Staff Richard Sutherland. There was no grandeur here, only the stench of diesel and fay. Each man was a bundle of conflicted emotion, shame at leaving, relief at surviving, dread of what they'd left behind. Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, the PT squadron commander, a man whose bravery was beyond question, navigated by instinct, avoiding the phosphorescent wakes of Japanese patrols. This was no dignified exit. It was a desperate, undignified scramble. Ahead lay not safety, but another gauntlet. At the Del Monte Pineapple Plantation airfield on Mindanao, they were to be met by 4 worn-out B-17 flying fortresses sent from Australia. Only 3 arrived, and 1 was deemed unflyable. MacArthur, his family, and his aides were crammed into the 2 remaining bombers for the final, terrifying leg to Darwin. As the overloaded B-17 shuddered into the air, Japanese fighters circled the field they had just left. The general stared out the window, his jaw set. The propaganda broadcast from Manila played in his mind on a loop, Dugout Doug. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to destroy his reputation and the morale of the troops still fighting. In Tokyo and in the frontline trenches on Bataan, Japanese soldiers and propagandists celebrated the caricature. The great American Caesar, they laughed, had fled his command. He was a paper tiger, hiding in a hole, then running away. The image was perfect, and it spread like a stain. When his plane finally touched down in Australia on March 17th, MacArthur was met by reporters. Exhausted, his uniform stained from the journey, he delivered a line that would define the next 2.5 years of war in the Pacific. His voice was gravel, but his tone was iron. The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines. I came through and I shall return. It was not a hopeful sentiment. It was a vow, a personal contract signed in the humiliation of that PT boat and sealed with the laughter of his enemies. To the world, it sounded defiant. To his staff, who knew the man, it sounded like a sentence he had passed upon himself and upon Japan. The road back would not begin in a headquarters. It would begin in the furious, meticulous planning to build an instrument of return so vast it could not be mocked. Forging the instrument of return. MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, was a hive of simmering resentment and monomaniacal focus. Map rooms were papered not just with tactical charts, but with the faces of men left behind. Wainwright, King, the tens of thousands on the death march. Every order issued, every supply request, every argument with the U.S. Navy, which favored a Central Pacific drive, was filtered through the lens of that promise, I shall return. The Dugout Doug taunt was a wound he would never acknowledge but which festered, driving him. His strategy, hit 'em where they ain't, the island-hopping campaign, was not merely tactical. It was the only path back to the Philippines that his limited resources and political will could sustain. Each landing at Hollandia, at Biak, at Morotai was a stepping stone paid for in blood, each one a silent reply to the laughter from Tokyo. Meanwhile, in shipyards from California to Virginia, the literal instrument of his return was taking shape. This was not just an army being built. It was a floating continent of war. The U.S. 7th Fleet, designated MacArthur's naval force, was unlike any other. Dubbed MacArthur's Navy sometimes with derision by the Pacific Fleet, it was a heterogeneous armada. At its heart were the venerable, slow-moving battleships like the USS Pennsylvania and USS Mississippi, resurrected from Pearl Harbor's mud. Surrounding them were flocks of cruisers, destroyers, and the true workhorses, the landing ship tank LST, and landing craft infantry LCI. These were not glamorous ships. They were floating garages and troop taxes, blunt-nosed and slow. And above them all would fly the planes of the escort carriers, the jeep carriers, small, mobile airfields that would provide the air cover for the invasion the deep-water fleet carriers could not. By September 1944, this colossal instrument was assembled in secret anchorages across New Guinea and the Admiralties. The scale was biblical. Soldiers of the Sixth Army, under the aggressive General Walter Kruger, shuffled up endless gangplanks, their packs heavy, their minds fixed on the rumors of their destination. They boarded transports with names like the USS Blue Ridge and USS Mount Olympus. The air hummed with the industrial smell of fuel, paint, and hot metal. On the bridge of his flagship, the heavy cruiser USS Nashville, MacArthur spent hours studying charts of Leyte Gulf. He was no longer the desperate fugitive on the PT boat. He was the architect of a storm. The Japanese, confident in their island bastions and still sneering at Dugout Doug, were looking the wrong way, anticipating the Central Pacific thrust. They did not see the true threat forming in the South, a threat carrying not just an army, but a personal vendetta of historic proportions. The mockery was about to meet its physical answer. The armada appears, a horizon of ships. October 20th, 1944. The approach to Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Before dawn, on the flag bridge of the Nashville, Douglas MacArthur stood in silence. He was dressed immaculately now, in a crisp khaki uniform, his gold-braided cap low over his eyes, corn-cob pipe unlit in his hand. Below him, the ship cut through a calm, dark sea. But it was not alone. As the first gray fingers of light stretched across the eastern horizon, they did not reveal empty ocean. They revealed a sight that no human being, not even the most seasoned admiral, had ever witnessed. To port, to starboard, ahead, and astern, as far as the eye could see and extending beyond the curvature of the earth, were ships. Hundreds of them. The massive, blocky silhouettes of troop transports and supply ships. The lower, sleeker profiles of destroyers and cruisers weaving protective screens. The unmistakable, broad decks of escort carriers. This was the vanguard of over 700 vessels of the 7th Fleet and the 3rd Fleet's fast carrier force, the greatest armada ever assembled. On the beaches of Leyte, in palm-thatched bunkers and concrete pillboxes, Japanese lookouts of the 16th Division rubbed their eyes. First, they heard it, a deep, pervasive hum on the edge of hearing, the collective vibration of 1,000 ship engines and screws churning the sea. Then, they saw the smudges on the horizon, a darkening that grew and solidified with terrifying speed. Through binoculars, the smudges resolved into a forest of masts, superstructures, and guns. A young lieutenant, struggling to comprehend the scale, fumbled for his field telephone. His report to headquarters was a choked whisper of disbelief. The horizon, he said, was made of ships. The myth of Dugout Doug, the coward who ran, shattered against the overwhelming, tangible reality of American industrial and military might now parked off their coast. This was not a raid. This was an entire civilization coming to reclaim what it had lost. At 9 o'clock, the world exploded. A deep-throated roar echoed across the Gulf as the 6 old battleships of the 7th Fleet's bombardment line, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, Maryland, West Virginia, Tennessee, and California, opened fire simultaneously. 15-inch and 14-inch shells, each the weight of a small car, tore through the morning sky with a sound like ripping canvas. They crash into the landing beaches at red and white beaches near the town of Palo, geysers of sand, palm trees, and earth erupting in a continuous rolling thunder. Behind this wall of steel, the landing craft formed up, a swarm of blunt-nosed boats circling in the smoky water. The air filled with the shriek of rockets from specially fitted LSIs, streaking inland in fiery arcs, and the relentless drone of carrier aircraft from Admiral Thomas Kincaid's escort carriers. The sea itself seemed to be moving forward, an unstoppable tide of men and metal. The promise, made in shame 2.5 years prior, was now being written in fire, high explosives, and an awe-inspiring display of power designed to be seen. I have returned, the psychological reckoning. By 1 p.m., the beachhead was secured enough for the next meticulously planned act. Aboard the Nashville, MacArthur descended a Jacob's ladder into a waiting landing craft, followed by Philippine President-in-Exile Sergio Mina and key staff. The craft, designated LCI 430 *, churned through the littered water, floating debris, spent casings, the flotsam of war. Around them, the symphony of invasion continued, the crump of distant naval shells, the rattle of small arms from the tree line, the shouts of beachmasters directing traffic. As the craft's ramp grounded on the wet sand of Red Beach, near the town of Palo, there was a moment of surreal pause. Then, with the theatrical timing of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind for 1,000 days, Douglas MacArthur strode down the ramp. He walked deliberately through knee-deep water, his uniform trousers soaked, ignoring the sporadic sniper fire cracking overhead. A Signal Corps photographer, poised in the surf, captured the iconic image. But the true moment came minutes later, at a hastily set-up radio transmitter on the beach, its microphone wrapped against the humid air. With the sounds of battle as his backdrop, MacArthur leaned in. His voice, amplified by radio across the Philippines into the world, was clear and resonant, devoid of the gravelly exhaustion of 1942. "People of the Philippines," he announced, "I have returned." The phrasing was deliberate. Not, "I shall return," the promise, but "I have returned," the accomplished fact. It was a statement of victory, a closure of the circle. The message was not just for the Filipino guerrillas listening in the hills. It was a direct, personal rebuttal broadcast to every Japanese soldier who had ever scoffed at the name Dugout Doug. The coward had not only come back, he had brought an entire fleet with him and was standing on the very ground they held. The psychological impact on the Japanese was immediate and profound. For the rank and file, the sheer scale of the armada annihilated any notion of American weakness or lack of resolve. The caricature was dead, replaced by a terrifyingly competent and now vengeful foe. For the high command in Tokyo, the landing at Leyte triggered the all-or-nothing naval response that would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a desperate, failed gamble to destroy the invasion fleet. They had mocked the man, and in doing so, they had profoundly misjudged the nation and the industrial beast they had awakened. MacArthur's return was not merely a military landing. It was the ultimate negation of Japanese propaganda. He had transformed the taunt of cowardice into a defining banner of a triumphant and deeply personal campaign of liberation. The man who left in darkness on a plywood boat had returned in the blinding light of a naval bombardment, and the world was watching. Legacy of the promise, from mockery to myth. The campaign for Leyte and ultimately the Philippines would be long and bloody, lasting for months. But October 20th, 1944, was a point of irreversible change. The image of MacArthur wading ashore, and more so, the staggering vista of the 600-ship armada that delivered him, became a psychological weapon of mass destruction against Japanese morale. In the weeks that followed, as the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed to its catastrophic defeat at Leyte Gulf, the ghost of Dugout Doug haunted their planning. Their entire desperate strategy was a reaction to the shocking reality of his return, a belated and futile attempt to kill the promise they had mocked into existence. For the American and Filipino forces, the return was a transcendent moment of vindication. To the survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, scattered in prison camps or fighting as guerrillas, the news was a lifeline. The promise had been real. The general they felt had abandoned them had, in fact, been building a sledgehammer to break down the gates. The narrative arc was perfect for Allied propaganda. The humiliated hero, the patient build-up, the dramatic and overwhelming return. It was a story that buried the Dugout Doug slur under an avalanche of steel and thunder. Douglas MacArthur's legacy is complex, but the fulfillment of his Philippine promise stands as its dramatic, unambiguous call. He understood that war is fought in the mind as much as on the battlefield. The Japanese propaganda intended to break his spirit and demoralize his men had instead provided the fuel for an obsession. He took their mockery, internalized it, and used it to forge an indomitable will, channeling the entire industrial might of the United States towards a single, personal objective. The 600 ships were not just a military force. They were the physical manifestation of a rebuttal. In the end, Dugout Doug did not hide in a hole. He returned at the head of the greatest fleet in history, turned their taunt into ashes, and wrote his own legend in the fire of their defeat.